I live in Seattle, which is the largest city in the United States named for a Native American. Largest city in the world, Chief Seattle. At the time that Curtis started out, there was one Indian left in the city, Princess Angela, the daughter of Chief Seattle. And the city founders had made it a crime for an Indian to live inside the city limits of what would become the largest city in the world named for a Native person. And Curtis found her living in this little shack down on the waterfront. She sold clams door to door. She did people's laundry. She was a little elfin figure, 4'11", and he was this big studly guy, 6'2", really good looking. Had a, he looked like Brad Pitt. He had this Van Dyke beard, penetrating blue eyes. Again, he was sort of a master of the universe type. But he sees Princess Angela on this day, stooped over, digging clams in Puget Sound. It's sort of a moment of artist and subject, and he sees something that he feels will slip away, and he courts her. And over the course of about a week, he talks her into coming up to his studio and pays her $1. And that's the first Native person, first subject. She died a few months later, and that picture went all over the world. It's a stunning picture. Anyone who says Curtis was guilty of romanticizing his subjects, she has lines in her face as deep as crevasses. Her gaze is just withering. She has a safety pin holding her shawl over her shoulder. She's holding a cane. And that's the look that Curtis wanted, which was sort of a defiant, you may have wiped us out, but you're going to remember this face. When Curtis was starting this, he not only wanted to tell the stories of all the Indians, their creation myths, their nation story, how they came to be, but the battles, the last battles as we knew them. And at the time, Custer was somewhat of a hero still. This was the last and biggest clash between the worlds. Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876. And there were many people alive who had fought on the side of the Indians, the Cheyenne and the Sioux. And there were Crow Indians who were scouts for Custer. Custer spent 3 summers going over the battle site with those survivors, trying to figure out, Curtis did, what happened there. And he also had a map. So after he did this, he did up this 76-page report. He sent it to President Roosevelt, then his mentor, and said, oh my God, the Custer story is bunk. He said this guy was not a hero. He sent his subordinate, Major Reno, down to be slaughtered. And in fact, he may have sat up on the grass and watched this slaughter going on because he wanted to get in on it later, thinking it would go his way. So he told it what would become the true story of what really happened on the Battle of Little Bighorn. He typed it up, he sent it to Roosevelt. Roosevelt said, this is magnificent, but you're playing with fire. Mrs. Custer, Libby Custer, the widow, was then very much alive and very much active in preserving her husband's myth. And she started a campaign to make sure this thing, Curtis gave an interview where the New York paper said, I found out what really happened in the Battle of Little Bighorn. She started this campaign to stop it. So, for the only time in his life, in the history of the North American Indians, Curtis pulled his punches. He typed up that 76-page report. He didn't put it in his 20 volumes or his volume on the Crow. And I read it in the Library of Congress when I was doing my research. And I'll tell you something, because it was just reopened about 10 years, it went under lock and key for 70 plus years. He absolutely nailed it. He was not only a magnificent photographer, but he was a journalist and a scholar and a historian. And when Nathaniel Philbrick did his recent book on the Little Bighorn, he credits Curtis, this photographer with a 6th grade education, as being one of the first people to figure out what truly happened. And he never got credit for it because, again, he pulled his punches.
If it isn't obvious, tell us what drew you to this whole story enough to want to write a book on it.
Well, I love grand adventures. I look for stories that have highs and lows, and this certainly had its lows. So many times he was broke, he was lost, he had to give it up, his wife left him, he was, living hand to mouth. He also did one of the first and most important movies ever, recognized as a just pioneering achievement in cinematography. The first all-native cast documentaries filmed on location in northern British Columbia off the Queen Charlotte Islands. And he used to do these, what would be now a really great TED Talk. He would hand paint his slides and have Native people singing at one of his shows. So he would appear at a show here in Chicago with Native people singing, and then he would show his slides, and he had hand-colored them. So he was a multimedia guy as well. But I love the story of the artist. because it's an old story. You do something magnificent, but in your lifetime, you're not recognized. I love the grand adventure part of it. I love the clash of the worlds. America was entering what would be known as the American century. Just as we pushed these original people to the farthest edges, they were out of sight. And at their low moment, one person said, we can't let this culture slip away. So, I mean, most stories of the artist are stories of people who have breakthroughs. They see the world differently. It's a painter or a writer like Hemingway who had a stripped down pose. This is a story of an artist who physically became a part of the snake dance ritual. Rode down the Columbia River before it was dammed and nearly died several times. Went up to the Arctic Circle and famously said he was euphoric up there in his kayak because he said, this is the first place I've been to in Indian country where there are no missionaries. And he said, if one should find his way here, I trust the Bering Sea will do its duty. So I love that tale of the lone adventurer type. I say he was, in some ways he was an Indiana Jones with a camera.
Right here we're in the land of librarians. Tell us about the Seattle librarian that he communicated with in his old age.
Yeah, it's a great story. When Curtis was in his 80s, he moved to Southern California, and for a while he shot pictures of fake Indians. They were mostly Italians in face paint on the back lot of a Hollywood lot. He's worked for Cecil B. DeMille, he worked for some of the leading directors of his day, and he hated it, just absolutely hated it. He knew more about Native people, authentic Native people than anyone. They were doing these fake stories. They redid the Custer story where he sort of won, and he hated it. So he's living alone in Beverly Hills, and the smog was really bad in LA. They didn't really clean up their air until the late 70s, early 80s, and he hated the air. And he just talked about how miserable he was. And he's living in this single-room apartment. He complained about the neighbor's television blaring. This guy he's a master, and he's living out his years. No one even knows who he is. And this librarian in Seattle discovers the North American Indian. She starts going through, looking at the prints, and it's, as anyone who's ever seen one of these original volumes, it's unbelievable. It's like there's no pixelation in the photos because he shot with glass plate negatives 8x10 and printed onto copper plates. So the finish is glorious, and they would photo engrave later to give it an added flourish. She starts looking through this and she says, who is this Curtis guy? Where is he? Where did this come from? She finds this in the back room of the Seattle Public Library. This thing that was hailed at one point to be the greatest bibliographic achievement since the King James Version of the Bible has now been forgotten by the 1950s. And she finds him, and she starts a correspondence with him. And for the last 3 years of her life, he tells her the story of his life. And they write back and forth 47 letters, and it's so touching. He says, I gave Princess Angeline $1 to pose for me. Do you know that if you go to the Guildhall Library in London today, you have to put on white gloves in order to look at the North American Indian? He talks about Geronimo, how much he loved him, and Chief Joseph and Nez Perce, the last of the famous tribal leaders. So she told his life story, and everyone wants their story told.
What kind of books do you read?
You know, I'm somewhat of an omnivore. So I read everything from just pulpy thrillers when I'm on airplanes. And I admit I was in Europe and I wanted a plane ride book. I read Gone Girl. I held up for the 11 hours. I figured it out about 12 pages in. So let's see, I'm reading The Orchardist right now. Great book of fiction, a Northwest book that I really love. I like nonfiction that's told sort of novelistically, good narrative nonfiction. Jess Ruin's Beautiful Ruins, Jess Walter's Beautiful Ruins was magnificant. I want to give that a plug wherever I can. I think he's at his top of his game right now. I went back and read a bunch of Joan Didion recently, and I was just blown away by how extraordinary her stuff is. So I'm really an omnivore. Read 2 or 3 books a week and just always look for something new so I can be blown away.
That's about all the time you and I have, but let's open it up to the audience. Questions?
Yes?
How did he pay for all his travel? You say he was broke most of the time, but he didn't.
I didn't have any pay.
Oh, That's a great question. And because at one point Curtis had 30 people on his staff. He had a great technician, a guy named Adolf Muir, who finished all his photos. He had translators. He had an editor and a writer to help him do the writing. There were 200,000 words of text in the complete North American Indian. And he would go to a reservation, sometimes spend an entire summer and not shoot a picture, just to try to get to know someone. People always say, well, he posed these pictures. Well, he posed them after getting to know people. And he was a portrait photographer, remember. He wasn't strictly a documentarian. He became that with the audio tapes, but he's a portrait photographer. So he was using his portrait business initially to pay for it. And then he went totally into arrears. And he went around the East Coast, tried to get the Smithsonian, and their American Indian experts said, well, you don't know anything about Indians. They have no religion, was one of the first things they told him. So in the first book he did on the Apache, it's almost like he's giving them the finger. The lead sentence is, everything the Apache do is inherently spiritual, is tied up in their spiritual life. So they wouldn't fund him. And he got to know these through Roosevelt. Of course, the rich hated Roosevelt, so Roosevelt said, I can't help you with these Gilded Age Titans. They're all bastards and sons of bitches, and they hate me. So he finally found his way to J.P. Morgan, who was in his 70s and just getting ready to open the Morgan Library. Now, Morgan was a collector of Renaissance art and mistresses, and also happened to be the de facto Federal Reserve before we had a Federal Reserve. Richest banker in America. Curtis goes in to see him, and he's at his wit's end. He's been doing this for 10 years, but he is really broke. And Morgan looks at some of the pictures and says, I'm sorry, I can't help you. And Curtis says, wait, let me show you one more picture. He turns to this picture of an 11-year-old girl, a Mojave girl. Her name was Mosa. So the whole project cost more than $3 million in those dollars, which is roughly $50 million today. He would just go to the Gates Foundation now and get a grant. But so when he had nothing and he'd mortgage everything, his studio, his home, he ended up giving the House of Morgan his copyright. And they then, in the Depression, sold all of the extra Curtis prints to a Boston bookseller for $1,000. He died, and they went down in the bookseller's basement, where they remained until they were rediscovered in the 1970s, and now individual prints can fetch $200,000.
Any more questions?
We just came from Seattle and we saw the exhibit at the Chihuly Museum. Have you seen that? And were you a part of that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh. We just saw the Seattle Chihuly Museum exhibit. Were you involved in having any input into how that was done? Or?
No, actually, that's a funny story. I should have said, Chihuly's mad at me because I wrote a story, a page one story in the New York Times about 5 years ago about how his ex-acolytes were suing him, and Chihuly was claiming he owned the seashell forms, and I said, no man can own nature. So Chihuly got really mad at me because of that story. So, but I know he's a great collector of Curtis.
Okay. So that's his collection?
Yeah, that's his collection. I'll tell you one thing. People come to Seattle in part in the summer because it's so glorious, but to see Chihuly's art. Curtis, at the height of his fame, was the #1 tourist attraction in the city. People would go to his studio. It was the top thing you had to do to look at these magnificent portraits. And there is a gallery there, and there's one in New Mexico, the two best Curtis galleries right now. Next time you go, you should go to look at that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Chihuly's been buying up. It's pretty funny because he's now the known artist in the city, and he's been buying up over the years. Yeah. But I think he hates me. So.
Are you writing anything now?
Yes, I am. I've just started to research a book. I can't say anything about it except it's an Irish-American Western that starts in Dublin and ends in Montana. So it gets me back to the old country and gets me into Montana.
So I think you would all agree that when people read the book and say, what an interesting story, it truly is, right? Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.